The weight of the duffel bag on Marcus Stone's shoulder was nothing compared to the weight pressing down on his chest. 12 years in Delta Force had taught him to carry heavy loads, gear, ammunition, sometimes even the bodies of brothers who didn't make it home. But none of that prepared him for this moment, standing with his 10-year-old daughter Emma at the edge of a circular driveway that gleamed like polished marble beneath the Connecticut sun. Before them rose not just a house, but a monument to wealth. The Hamilton estate sprawled across manicured grounds, its Georgian columns reaching toward a cloudless October sky. German sedans and gleaming SUVs lined the drive like a luxury car showcase. Through tall windows, Marcus could see crystal chandeliers catching afternoon light, casting rainbows across rooms larger than most people's entire homes. The garden party was in full swing. Men in linen jackets moved between perfectly arranged flower beds, their conversations punctuated by the gentle clink of crystal glasses. Women in pastel dresses laughed with practiced ease, while servers in crisp white uniforms glided between guests, carrying silver trays of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. This world had once been his, or at least he'd tried to belong to it. For 5 years, he'd played the role of the war hero who'd married into Connecticut royalty. Marcus Stone, the decorated Delta Force operator who'd won the heart of Victoria Hamilton, daughter of real estate magnate Richard Hamilton. The fairy tale had seemed perfect from the outside, but fairy tales Marcus had learned were often built on foundations of sand. The guests noticed them before the iron gate even closed behind them. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Laughter shrank to nervous murmurs. Heads turned with synchronized precision, except these weren't soldiers. These were Connecticut's elite, and they were watching the fallen hero make his final retreat. Victoria sat beneath a white canvas canopy surrounded by her sisters, her parents, and a circle of friends who'd never had to choose between dignity and survival. Her honey blonde hair was perfectly styled, her designer sunglasses perched atop her head like a crown. When she saw him approaching, her lips curved into that familiar smile, the one that said she'd pretend to be gracious for the cameras. She didn't rise from her chair, didn't even remove her sunglasses. Instead, she tilted her head with theatrical precision as if she were an actress hitting her mark in a play she'd rehearsed 1,000 times. Marcus felt Emma's small hand tighten in his own. At 10 years old, his daughter was already too perceptive, too aware of the undercurrents that adults tried to hide. She stood quietly beside him, her backpack clutched in her free hand, watching the tableau unfold with eyes that missed nothing. The legal documents crinkled in Marcus's jacket pocket as he reached for them. The custody agreement, signed and notarized just 2 hours earlier, represented the end of an 18-month legal battle that had consumed everything he owned. The house they'd once shared gone, his savings account drained by legal fees. The classic Mustang he had restored after coming home from Afghanistan sold to pay his lawyer. But there was one thing Victoria couldn't take from him. One thing her father's money and influence couldn't purchase or manipulate. His daughter. Marcus stepped forward and placed the manila envelope on the white wicker table beside Victoria's untouched mimosa. Victoria's fingers, manicured to perfection, barely glanced at the documents before passing them to the man seated beside her. Theodore Whitman, the Hamilton family attorney, had been fighting Marcus in court for over a year. The lawyer's expression remained neutral as he scanned the custody order, but Marcus caught the slight tightening around his eyes. They'd lost, and they knew it. The murmur started from Victoria's cousins, something about that dump on the hill and raising a child in squalor. Other guests picked up the thread, their voices carrying just loud enough for Marcus to hear. Comments about the moldy shack and that crazy hermit's house, and wondering aloud how anyone could subject a child to such conditions. The house they were talking about belonged to David Clark, Marcus's great-uncle. David had been the black sheep, the one relative everyone mentioned in whispers, or not at all, a recluse who'd inherited a crumbling Victorian mansion in the Vermont mountains and had lived there alone for 30 years until his death 6 months earlier. When the will was read, everyone had been shocked to learn that David had left the entire property to Marcus. 60 acres of wooded land where privacy was still possible, and a man could think without neighbors peering over his fence. The family had been mystified. Marcus had met David exactly twice in his life, both times at funerals, where the old man had sat in the back row and left before the reception. But somehow David had remembered him. The video started before Marcus even realized someone was filming, a guest with a smartphone capturing what would become a viral moment. The caption would write itself later. Disgraced veteran takes daughter from wealthy family to live in ruins. Marcus reached into his other pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Victoria's engagement ring, the 3-carat diamond that had once represented their future together. He placed it beside the legal documents without ceremony, without drama, without the grand gesture that part of him wanted to make. Emma tugged on his hand and held up a folded piece of paper, her phone number written in careful cursive. Not for him, but for Victoria. His daughter was trying to build a bridge her mother had already burned. Victoria took the paper, glanced at it, then slipped it into her purse without comment. No acknowledgement of the gesture, no recognition of her daughter's attempt at reconciliation. The garden party resumed its rhythm around them as Marcus and Emma turned to leave. But Marcus could feel the weight of judgment following them across the manicured lawn down the circular drive toward the battered pickup truck that looked as out of place among the luxury vehicles as he felt among these people. The truck's engine turned over with a reluctant growl. Emma climbed into the passenger seat and immediately pulled out a worn paperback book, her constant companion. She'd been reading since she was 4, devouring everything from picture books to novels meant for teenagers. It was her way of processing the world, of escaping into stories where problems had solutions and heroes eventually won. The drive from Connecticut to Vermont would take about 4 hours, enough time for Marcus to second-guess every decision that had led to this moment. The GPS showed their route, threading through small New England towns past covered bridges and autumn foliage that belonged on postcards. The first hour passed in comfortable silence. Emma read while Marcus drove, both of them processing the magnitude of what had just happened. They'd won the legal battle, but winning felt strange when it meant leaving everything familiar behind. As they crossed into Massachusetts, Emma finally spoke without looking up from her book. She asked if he was scared about starting over. Marcus considered the question while navigating through traffic. Fear wasn't quite the right word. Uncertainty, maybe. Apprehension about the unknown. But also something else, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. He told her that sometimes starting over was the only way to figure out who you really were. That maybe they'd both been living someone else's idea of what their lives should look like, and now they had a chance to write their own story. Emma nodded thoughtfully, then returned to her book. But Marcus noticed she was watching the landscape change outside her window, taking in the transition from suburban sprawl to rural countryside, from the known to the mysterious. The pickup's radio crackled with static as they climbed into the Green Mountains. Reception faded in and out, catching fragments of news reports and country songs before dissolving back into white noise. The isolation was immediate and complete. Cell phone towers became sparse, then non-existent. The road narrowed from 4 lanes to 2, then from asphalt to gravel. They were entering a different world, one where success wasn't measured in square footage or net worth, where a man's value wasn't determined by his address or his wife's family connections. A world where David Clark had chosen to spend the last 3 decades of his life. The GPS began to struggle as they climbed higher into the mountains. The robotic voice became uncertain, recalculating their route every few minutes as the digital map tried to make sense of roads that barely existed. Marcus had printed backup directions, a precaution that proved wise as they turned onto what was generously labeled a private drive, but looked more like a hiking trail. The truck bounced and lurched over ruts and stones, its suspension groaning in protest. Pine trees pressed close on both sides, their branches scraping the roof with fingernail sounds that made Emma look up from her book with concern. The track wound upward through dense forest, climbing steadily towards something they couldn't yet see. Then the trees parted and they saw their new home for the first time. David Clark's house sat on a natural shelf carved into the mountainside, a Gothic revival mansion that might have been grand once but now looked like something from a ghost story. 3 stories of weathered clapboard siding rose toward a slate roof that sagged in several places. Windows were either boarded up or missing their glass entirely. The wraparound porch tilted at dangerous angles, and ivy had claimed most of the eastern wall. A rusted mailbox hung by a single bolt, its faded nameplate barely readable. The driveway ended in a circle of broken asphalt, where weeds grew through cracks wide enough to lose a shoe in. An old wind chime made of tarnished spoons and forks hung motionless from a porch beam, its music silenced by rust and neglect. Emma closed her book and stared through the windshield without speaking. Marcus turned off the engine and listened to the absolute silence that followed. No traffic sounds, no neighbors, no lawnmowers or air conditioners or any of the mechanical hums that formed the soundtrack of suburban life. just whined in the pine trees and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. They climbed out of the truck and approached the house on foot, their footsteps crunching on gravel and fallen leaves. The front gate, wrought iron that might once have been elegant, groaned open with a protest of hinges that hadn't been oiled in years. The porch steps creaked ominously under Marcus's weight, one board sagging far enough to suggest rot beneath the surface. The front door was solid oak, painted forest green, sometime in the distant past. The key David's lawyer had given Marcus turned with surprising ease, as if the lock had been maintained even while everything else deteriorated. The door swung open with a long, mournful creak that seemed to echo through empty rooms beyond. But as Marcus stepped across the threshold, his military instincts immediately kicked in. Something was wrong. The dust patterns on the floor near the entrance weren't uniform. Someone had been here recently, and they'd tried to cover their tracks, but hadn't been careful enough to fool eyes trained in reconnaissance. Emma noticed his sudden tension and stayed close as Marcus examined the entry hall more carefully. Footprints in the dust, partially obscured but still visible to someone who knew what to look for. At least two people moving with the careful steps of professionals trying not to leave obvious traces. Then Marcus saw it. Tucked behind the newel post at the bottom of the staircase, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, a small electronic device no bigger than a matchbook. A listening device, high-end military grade, the kind used for long-term surveillance operations. David Clark had been dead for 6 months, but someone was still monitoring his house. Someone had been waiting for exactly this moment for the new owners to arrive and potentially discover whatever secrets the old man had left behind. Marcus pocketed the device without saying anything to Emma, but his daughter had inherited his observational skills. She was watching his face, reading the tension in his shoulders, understanding without words that they weren't alone in this house, even though it appeared empty. The smell hit them as they moved deeper inside. Not the sharp stench of decay, but something subtler and more pervasive. Dust and mildew, certainly, but underneath that, something sadder. The smell of loneliness, of rooms that had held no laughter for too long, of a house that had forgotten what it meant to be a home. Sheets covered most of the furniture like ghosts frozen in domestic tasks. Dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon sunlight that managed to penetrate the gloom through uncovered windows. The wooden floors were solid beneath layers of grime, and the bones of the house felt strong despite the cosmetic decay. Marcus found light switches that did nothing. The electricity had been turned off years ago along with the water and gas. But the stone fireplace in what had probably been the living room looked functional, and he'd brought camping gear expecting exactly this situation. Emma explored while Marcus unloaded their supplies from the truck, but he kept her within earshot at all times. His military training was screaming warnings about this place, about the surveillance device, about the feeling that they were being watched from the shadows of the surrounding forest. Her voice echoed from the back of the house as she called out discoveries. A kitchen with an ancient cast-iron stove, a dining room with built-in china cabinets, a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves, most of them still filled with books. It was in the library that Emma found the first real hint of the mystery that would reshape their lives. She was examining the bookshelves when she noticed something odd about the room's proportions. The wall behind the largest bookcase seemed thicker than necessary, and when she pressed her ear against it, she could hear a faint echo as if there were empty space beyond. Marcus was building a fire in the main fireplace when Emma's excited voice brought him running. She stood before the bookshelf, her hands pressed against what looked like solid wood paneling. Her expression lit with the kind of curiosity that had always gotten her into trouble at school. She'd found a seam barely visible unless you knew where to look running vertically along the edge of one section. When Marcus examined it more closely, he could feel a slight draft coming through the crack, carrying air from somewhere else, somewhere hidden. The mechanism that opened the concealed door was elegant in its simplicity. Pressure applied to a specific sequence of book spines caused a section of the shelving unit to swing inward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow room beyond. Emergency flashlight in hand, Marcus stepped through the opening with Emma close behind both of them, holding their breath as the beam illuminated David Clark's secret. The hidden room was small but perfectly preserved, as if it had been sealed away from time itself. A desk sat in the center, its surface covered with manila folders, yellowed newspapers, and what looked like surveillance photographs. Filing cabinets lined the walls, some locked, others standing open as if their owner had left in a hurry. But it was the far wall that drew their attention, a massive corkboard covered with photographs, documents, and red string connecting various elements in a web of relationships that spoke of obsession, investigation, or both. At the center of it all was a newspaper headline that made Marcus's blood run cold. Watergate scandal rocks White House. The date was June 1972, more than 50 years ago. But surrounding that central headline were dozens of other articles, photographs of government buildings, surveillance shots of men in suits, and what appeared to be classified documents marked with stamps and seals Marcus recognized from his own military service. Emma picked up a folder from the desk, her voice barely above a whisper as she read the tab. Operation Nightshade. Inside were typewritten reports, some with heavy black redactions, others bearing David Clark's signature and military intelligence letterhead. Whatever David had been involved in during the early 1970s, it had been significant enough to classify and important enough for him to keep detailed records for half a century. But it was the photograph tucked into the front of the folder that stopped Marcus cold. A black and white image of a young man in military uniform standing with a group of other soldiers in front of what looked like a government building. The face was familiar, though younger and harder than Marcus remembered. It was David Clark, but not the reclusive old man who'd attended family funerals. This was David as a warrior, a professional, someone who'd served his country in ways that left no public record. Emma was examining other folders, her natural curiosity overriding any sense of caution about prying into a dead man's secrets. She found financial records, correspondence with banks, and what appeared to be property deeds for locations across the country. David Clark hadn't just been a recluse living in a decaying mansion. He'd been a man with resources, connections, and secrets that someone was still trying to monitor even after his death. Marcus thought about the surveillance device he'd found, about the feeling of being watched that had followed them since they'd arrived. Whoever had planted that device knew they were here now. The question was what they planned to do about it. As if summoned by his thoughts, the sound of a car engine in the distance made them both freeze. Marcus killed the flashlight, immediately motioning for Emma to stay quiet as he listened to the approaching vehicle. The engine sound was different from his truck, smoother and more powerful. Someone was coming up their private drive, someone who either knew the way or had been monitoring their arrival. Through the library's grimy windows, Marcus watched a black SUV with tinted windows navigate the rutted track with careful precision. The vehicle stopped short of the house, idling for several long minutes, as if its occupants were observing, assessing, planning. Then the engine died and two men got out. They were dressed in dark suits, despite the rural setting, their movements coordinated with military precision. One carried what looked like a briefcase, while the other scanned the house and surrounding area with the systematic attention of someone conducting surveillance. Neither looked like a neighbor dropping by to welcome new residents. Marcus guided Emma deeper into the hidden room, positioning them behind the filing cabinets where they couldn't be seen from the door. He drew the concealed panel almost closed, leaving just enough gap to see into the library while remaining hidden. Whatever David Clark had been involved in, whoever these men were, they represented a complication he hadn't anticipated. The front door opened without any sound of forced entry. These visitors had keys or knew how to enter without breaking the locks. Footsteps echoed through the empty house, measured and professional, as the intruders began a systematic search of the ground floor. Emma pressed against Marcus's shoulder, her breathing carefully controlled despite her obvious fear. At 10 years old, she was displaying the kind of composure under pressure that made Marcus proud, even in the middle of what was clearly a dangerous situation. The men's voices carried from the main rooms as they searched their conversation, revealing that this wasn't their first visit to David Clark's house. They knew the layout, knew where to look, and most importantly, they knew about the library and its potential secrets. One of them mentioned the old man's files and confirming complete recovery. They were looking for exactly what Marcus and Emma had just discovered. The question was whether they'd find the concealed room that David had somehow kept secret for half a century. The footsteps approached the library, and Marcus felt Emma tense beside him. Through the crack in the panel, he could see shadows moving in the doorway, could hear the men discussing something about modified architecture and concealed storage. They knew about hidden rooms in general, but they couldn't find this specific one. David Clark, the reclusive old man who'd somehow remembered a great-nephew he barely knew, had built his secrets to last. The concealed door remained invisible, even under professional scrutiny, its mechanism triggered only by a sequence that had died with its creator. After 20 minutes that felt like hours, the searchers moved on to other parts of the house. Marcus heard them climbing the stairs to the second floor, their voices fading as they continued their methodical investigation. Whatever they were looking for, they hadn't found it. Yet. Emma tugged on Marcus's sleeve and pointed to something he'd missed in the darkness. A small metal box tucked behind one of the filing cabinets, nearly invisible, unless you were looking for it from exactly the right angle. Inside the box was a key, old-fashioned and ornate, and attached to it was a note in David's careful handwriting. The first key unlocks the second truth. Look where memory sleeps, then where foundations fail. Marcus stared at the cryptic message, understanding immediately that David had created some kind of puzzle, a series of clues that would lead to something more important than the files they'd already discovered. The old man had known that someone would come looking for his secrets, and he'd prepared accordingly. The searchers spent another hour going through the house before finally giving up. Marcus heard them talking about additional resources and expanded search parameters as they prepared to leave. One mentioned returning with proper equipment once they'd confirmed the subject's routine. They knew Marcus and Emma were living in the house now. This search had been reconnaissance, not recovery. They'd be back probably better prepared and certainly more thorough. After the SUV's engine faded into the distance, Marcus and Emma emerged from their hiding place. The hidden room suddenly felt less like a discovery and more like a burden filled with secrets that people were willing to break into houses to find. But as Marcus looked at his daughter, saw the determined expression on her young face as she examined David's cryptic note, he realized something important. They weren't just inheriting a house and some old documents. They were inheriting a mission, a responsibility that David had somehow known would eventually fall to them. The first day in their new home had revealed that their inheritance was far more complex than a simple real estate transfer. David Clark had left them not just property, but a mystery that had kept dangerous people searching for answers for half a century. And whatever those answers were, they were worth killing for. Dawn broke over the Vermont mountains with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the previous night's terror seem like a fever dream. Marcus woke on the library floor where he'd kept watch, his body stiff from sleeping in a tactical position with one hand on the hunting knife he'd retrieved from his pack. Emma was still curled in her sleeping bag near the cold fireplace, her breathing deep and peaceful despite everything they'd witnessed. The surveillance device sat on the mantelpiece like a malevolent eye, its small LED indicator dark but somehow still menacing. Marcus had disabled it after the intruders left, but he knew there would be others. Professional surveillance operations never relied on a single device, and whoever was monitoring David Clark's house had resources that suggested government backing or private military contractors. Emma stirred as the first rays of sunlight penetrated the grimy windows, her eyes immediately alert in the way of children who'd learned to wake up ready for anything. She'd inherited more than his observation skills, Marcus realized. She had his survival instincts honed by months of listening to her parents fight and learning to read the emotional weather of adult dysfunction. The morning routine was sparse but familiar. Cold breakfast from cans, water from bottles. Marcus had brought a quick inventory of their supplies and situation. They had enough food for 3 days, maybe 4, if they stretched it. The nearest town was 20 miles down mountain roads that became impassable in winter weather, and October in Vermont meant snow could come without warning. But their immediate problem wasn't supplies. It was the puzzle David Clark had left behind, starting with the cryptic note attached to the ornate key they had found in the hidden room. The first key unlocks the second truth. Look where memory sleeps, then where foundations fail. Emma studied the note over her breakfast of cold beans, her 10-year-old mind attacking the riddle with the systematic approach she brought to everything. She'd always been good with puzzles, word games, the kind of lateral thinking that teachers either loved or found disruptive depending on their tolerance for children who asked too many questions. Memory sleeps could mean a dozen things. Bedrooms, obviously, but also places where memories were stored. Photo albums, diaries, or in David's case, possibly the extensive files they'd discovered. Emma suggested they start with the most literal interpretation and work outward from there. The house had 4 bedrooms on the second floor, each one a monument to decades of neglect. Water damage had buckled floorboards and stained walls with abstract patterns that looked like Rorschach tests designed by a depressive. The master bedroom was the largest, with windows that would have provided spectacular views of the valley below if they hadn't been boarded up from the inside. It was Emma who noticed the incongruity. The master bedroom's closet was smaller than it should be given the room's dimensions and the external architecture of the house. The back wall was too close to the front, creating a space that didn't account for the full depth of the structure. Marcus measured the discrepancy with careful steps, while Emma examined the closet's back wall for hidden mechanisms. The difference was significant, almost 6 feet of space that existed according to the house's exterior, but was missing from the interior layout. The trigger was elegantly simple once they found it. A loose floorboard in the closet's corner, when depressed with the right amount of pressure, caused the back wall to pivot inward on concealed hinges. Beyond was another hidden space, this one larger than the room behind the library and clearly designed for long-term storage. David Clark's second secret room was a monument to obsession and preparation. Steel filing cabinets lined the walls, each one meticulously labeled with dates, operation names, and classification levels that made Marcus's military security clearance seem quaint by comparison. A desk dominated the center of the space, its surface covered with maps of Washington, D.C., architectural plans of government buildings, and what appeared to be surveillance schedules for high-ranking officials from the 1970s. But it was the photographs that made Marcus's blood run cold. Hundreds of them arranged in chronological order across multiple bulletin boards. Images of meetings in parking garages, handshakes in congressional corridors, briefcases being exchanged in hotel lobbies. Professional surveillance photography that captured what looked like systematic corruption at the highest levels of American government. Emma found the connection that tied everything together. A photograph dated March 1973 showed a younger Richard Hamilton, Victoria's father, shaking hands with a man Marcus didn't recognize outside what appeared to be a Swiss bank. The notation on the back, written in David's careful handwriting, identified Hamilton as financial conduit for Operation Nightshade unauthorized fund transfers. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. David Clark hadn't just been investigating the Watergate break-in. He'd uncovered something much larger, a systematic network of government officials selling classified information and using the proceeds to fund black operations that existed outside congressional oversight or constitutional authority. And Richard Hamilton, the respected businessman who'd built a real estate empire and raised a family in Connecticut luxury, had been the banker for treason. Marcus was studying financial records that documented millions of dollars in transfers when Emma's sharp intake of breath brought his attention to what she'd discovered in one of the filing cabinets. A folder marked personal insurance contained documents that would have destroyed careers and possibly toppled governments if they'd been made public in the 1970s. Bank routing numbers for accounts in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and Luxembourg. Names and social security numbers of CIA operatives whose identities had been sold to hostile foreign intelligence services. Most damning of all, a list of American military personnel who'd been killed in Vietnam as a direct result of compromised intelligence, with dates, locations, and the specific information that had led to their deaths. 43 names. 43 American soldiers whose families had never known that their sons and husbands had died, not in combat, but as victims of betrayal by their own government officials. The emotional weight of this discovery was crushing. Marcus had served in Afghanistan, had lost brothers to enemy action, had attended too many funerals for men who died believing they were protecting their country. To learn that American servicemen had been deliberately sacrificed for profit, that their deaths had funded a shadow network of corruption, made him physically ill with rage and grief. Emma seemed to sense the magnitude of what they'd found, though she couldn't fully comprehend the implications. She continued methodically examining files. Her natural curiosity now focused with the intensity of someone who understood they were uncovering something historically significant. It was Emma who found the audio equipment hidden behind a false panel in one of the filing cabinets. A professional recording system with dozens of cassette tapes, each one labeled with dates and initials that corresponded to the surveillance photographs. David had been recording meetings, conversations, confessions. He had voices to go with the faces' admissions of guilt from people who thought they were speaking in confidence to a trusted colleague. Marcus selected a tape labeled RH, Primary Confession, March 1973, and fed it into the player. Richard Hamilton's voice, younger but unmistakably his, filled the hidden room with casual admissions of treason that would have sent him to death row if they'd been made public 50 years ago. Hamilton's recorded voice described the financial arrangements with chilling matter-of-factness. How classified intelligence about troop movements, supply routes, and planned operations was sold to North Vietnamese contacts for substantial sums. How the money was then laundered through legitimate business transactions and used to fund unauthorized intelligence operations that reported to no congressional oversight committee. The recording also revealed something that made Marcus's blood freeze. Hamilton wasn't just a financier in this conspiracy. He was one of the architects working with high-level officials in the CIA and Defense Department to create a shadow government that could operate outside constitutional constraints. They called themselves the Guardians, and they believed they were saving America from itself by taking actions that elected officials were too weak or naive to authorize. Emma had found another folder while Marcus listened to the recordings, this one containing what appeared to be organizational charts and operational hierarchies. The conspiracy reached into every level of American government and military command, with tentacles extending into private industry, academia, and international finance. But it was the document at the bottom of the folder that changed everything Marcus thought he understood about their situation. A birth certificate, yellowed with age and bearing official seals that listed David Clark not as Marcus's great-uncle, but as his father. The certificate told a story that recontextualized everything Marcus had experienced growing up. His mother had been David's lover, not his sister. The family had constructed an elaborate deception to hide Marcus's true parentage, probably to protect him from David's enemies, or to maintain family respectability in an era when such arrangements were scandalous. The emotional impact was immediate and overwhelming. Marcus had grown up believing himself to be the son of a man who died when he was 3, raised by a mother who'd struggled with depression and alcohol abuse throughout his childhood. Now he learned that his real father had been alive the entire time, living in exile just a few hundred miles away, watching from a distance as his son grew up without him. Emma absorbed this revelation with the resilience that had carried her through her parents' divorce and the upheaval of their new life. She asked practical questions about what it meant for their safety and their legal situation, displaying the kind of analytical thinking that suggested she'd inherited David's intellectual gifts along with his genetic material. The discovery also explained why David had left everything to Marcus. This wasn't a random bequest to a distant relative. David Clark had spent 30 years accumulating evidence and preparing for the day when he could pass the responsibility for justice to his own son. But before Marcus could fully process the implications of this revelation, they heard it. The distant sound of a vehicle approaching up the mountain road, its engine note different from the SUV they'd encountered the previous night. This was something larger, more powerful, and it was coming fast. Marcus moved to the boarded window and carefully peeled back a corner of the covering. What he saw made his military training kick into high gear immediately. A black military-style helicopter was approaching from the south, flying low and fast in a pattern that suggested tactical insertion rather than casual observation. The aircraft circled the property twice before settling into a hover above the clearing where Marcus had parked his truck. Ropes dropped from both sides of the helicopter, and 6 figures in full tactical gear fast roped to the ground with the precision of special operations forces. These weren't private security contractors or government bureaucrats. These were elite military operatives, and they were here for a combat mission. Marcus grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her away from the window as the helicopter landed and disgorged additional personnel. Through the walls of the old house, they could hear radio chatter and the sound of equipment being distributed. Someone was coordinating a major operation, and the target was obviously David Clark's house and whatever secrets it contained. But they also heard something else that made Marcus realize their situation was even more desperate than he'd initially thought. One of the voices outside was familiar, belonging to someone he'd served with in Afghanistan. James Patterson, a Delta Force operator who'd been Marcus's team leader during his final deployment. Patterson was supposed to be retired, collecting his pension and maybe working private security for corporate executives. His presence here suggested that the conspiracy David had documented wasn't just historical. It was still active, still powerful enough to deploy military assets against civilian targets on American soil. Emma tugged on Marcus's sleeve and pointed to something she'd noticed while he was focused on the threat outside. Another filing cabinet, this one standing alone against the far wall of the hidden room, secured with a lock that was different from all the others they'd encountered. This one required not just a key but a combination, and attached to it was a note in David's handwriting that read, "Emergency Protocol, Final Truth." The numbers came to Emma with the intuitive leap that had always amazed her teachers and sometimes frightened her parents. She'd been studying David's notes and documents, absorbing the patterns and connections with the pattern recognition skills that made her exceptional at puzzles. The combination was a date November 22, 1963, the day President Kennedy was assassinated. Inside the cabinet was David's masterpiece, the evidence that had kept him hiding in a Vermont mansion for 30 years and had people still searching for him a decade after his death. A complete record of what he called the American betrayal, documenting not just the Watergate cover-up, but the deeper conspiracy that had used the political chaos of the early 1970s to establish a shadow network within the American government. The documents were extensive and meticulously organized, showing how the Guardians had evolved from a small group of intelligence officials convinced they were protecting America into a vast network that controlled aspects of foreign policy, military operations, and domestic surveillance. They'd survived multiple administrations, recruited new members across party lines, and accumulated enough power and resources to operate as a government within the government. Richard Hamilton's financial empire wasn't just built on war, profiteering, and money laundering. It was the primary funding mechanism for the Guardian's ongoing operations, which included assassinations, election manipulation, and the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened to expose their activities. The voices outside were getting closer, accompanied by the sound of equipment being deployed around the perimeter of the house. Marcus could hear Patterson coordinating with his team, assigning sectors and establishing communications protocols. They were preparing for a methodical search that would find every hiding place David had constructed over 3 decades. But David had prepared for this contingency too. Emma found the architectural drawings in the emergency cabinet, showing not just the hidden rooms they'd already discovered, but a network of passages and tunnels that connected various parts of the structure to natural caves in the mountainside. The master bedroom's hidden room had a second exit concealed behind what looked like a solid stone wall. The mechanism required both the ornate key they'd found the previous night and a specific sequence of pressure points that David had documented in his emergency instructions. Marcus gathered the most critical documents, while Emma helped by selecting files that contained the most recent correspondence. Letters and memos dated within the past 5 years showed that the Guardians were still active, still recruiting, still eliminating threats to their network. David's death 6 months earlier might not have been from natural causes after all. The passage beyond the concealed exit was narrow and steep, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the house. Emergency lighting powered by a hidden generator system illuminated the way deeper into the mountain, following what appeared to be a natural cave system that David had modified and expanded over the years. Emma followed Marcus through the underground network without complaint, though he could feel her tension in the way she gripped his hand. The air was cold and damp, carrying the mineral scent of deep stone and the distant sound of running water. They were moving through the foundations of the mountain itself, following an escape route that David had prepared for exactly this kind of emergency. Behind them, the sounds of forced entry echoed through the house as Patterson's team began their systematic destruction of David's life's work. Marcus could hear explosives being used to blast open locked doors and hidden compartments. They weren't just searching anymore. They were eliminating evidence, making sure that nothing David had accumulated over 30 years would survive to threaten the Guardians. The underground passage branched and twisted through the mountainside, with occasional rooms that served as supply caches and communication centers. David had created not just an escape route, but an entire underground facility that could support extended operations. The man had been preparing for a war that had finally arrived, though he hadn't lived to fight it himself. They emerged from the cave system nearly a mile from the house through an opening concealed behind a waterfall that couldn't be seen from any of the forest roads. The sound of explosions from the direction of the house indicated that Patterson's team was being thorough in their destruction. Smoke was beginning to rise above the tree line, suggesting that they were burning what they couldn't blow up. Hidden beneath a camouflage tarp near the waterfall was David's final contingency. A motorcycle, an old but well-maintained dirt bike that would be perfect for navigating mountain trails where larger vehicles couldn't follow. The key was in a waterproof container along with maps showing routes to safe houses and contact information for people who might help. But more importantly, there was a letter addressed simply to my son, written in David's careful handwriting and dated just 2 months before his death. The letter explained everything Marcus had never understood about his childhood, his family, and the forces that had shaped his life from birth. David had been recruited into military intelligence during Vietnam, where his analytical skills and attention to detail had made him invaluable for investigating suspected security breaches. The work had led him deeper into the intelligence community, where he'd gradually become aware of unauthorized operations and financial irregularities that suggested systematic corruption. His investigation of Operation Nightshade had started as a routine security inquiry, but had uncovered a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American government. When he tried to report his findings through official channels, he discovered that many of the people he was supposed to report to were part of the conspiracy itself. The Guardians had tried to recruit him, offering him wealth, power, and position within their shadow network. When he'd refused, they'd begun systematically destroying his career and reputation. The final threat had come in the form of surveillance photos of Marcus's mother taken when Marcus was just 2 years old. The message had been clear: join them or watch his family die. David had chosen exile instead, faking his own breakdown and retreat to Vermont, while secretly continuing his investigation and accumulating evidence that could someday bring the Guardians to justice. He'd watched Marcus grow up from a distance, proud of his son's military service, but terrified that the Guardians would eventually connect Marcus to him. The letter ended with an apology and a challenge. David was sorry he'd never been able to be a real father, sorry he'd had to watch his son struggle without ever offering help or guidance. But he was also proud of the man Marcus had become, and he believed that Marcus had the courage and integrity to finish what he'd started. Emma read the letter over Marcus's shoulder, her young face serious as she absorbed the implications of what David was asking them to do. They weren't just inheriting property and documents. They were inheriting a mission that had cost David 30 years of his life and might cost them everything they had left. From their position behind the waterfall, Marcus and Emma could see smoke rising from multiple points around David's property. The house that had briefly been their home was being systematically obliterated, along with any physical evidence that might have threatened the Guardians. Patterson's team was professional and thorough, leaving nothing to chance. But David's real legacy wasn't in the building or even in the documents they'd managed to save. It was in the knowledge they now possessed, the understanding of how deep the corruption went and how many people were still willing to kill to keep it secret. The motorcycle started on the first try, its engine echoing off the mountainside as Marcus and Emma prepared to disappear into the Vermont wilderness. They carried with them not just evidence of historical crimes, but proof that the Guardians were still active, still dangerous, and still willing to deploy military force against American citizens who threatened their operations. Emma climbed onto the bike behind Marcus, her arms tight around his waist as they rode away from the smoke and destruction. She'd lost another home, another chance at stability, but she'd gained something more valuable. She'd learned that some secrets were worth preserving, some truths were worth fighting for, and some legacies demanded courage from those who inherited them. The road ahead wound through mountain passes and hidden valleys, leading toward a confrontation that had been 50 years in the making. Behind them, the house continued to burn, taking with it the last physical traces of David Clark's long exile. But his real work was just beginning, carried forward by the son who'd never known him and the granddaughter who'd inherited his determination to see justice done. Somewhere in Connecticut, Richard Hamilton was about to learn that the past he thought he'd buried was very much alive and coming for him with 30 years of accumulated evidence and the righteous anger of a son who'd finally learned the truth about his father. The war David Clark had been preparing for his entire adult life was about to begin, and Marcus Stone was ready to finish what his father had started. The motorcycle's engine cut through the mountain silence as Marcus navigated narrow logging trails that wound deeper into Vermont's wilderness. Emma's grip around his waist had loosened as they put distance between themselves and the burning house, but her alertness remained sharp. The weight of David's revelation pressed on Marcus's chest like a physical burden. 35 years of believing he was one person only to discover his entire identity had been built on a carefully constructed lie. His father hadn't died when Marcus was 3, as his mother had told him. David Clark had been alive the entire time, watching from exile, while his son grew up believing himself abandoned. The emotional impact was staggering, made worse by the knowledge that it was too late for reconciliation, too late for the relationship they might have had. Emma seemed to sense his internal struggle without fully understanding its source. She'd been unusually quiet since they'd fled the cave system, her young mind processing revelations that would challenge most adults. Marcus caught her watching him in the motorcycle's mirrors, her expression showing the kind of concern that children develop when their primary source of security appears vulnerable. They'd been riding for 2 hours when Marcus made the decision to deviate from David's planned route to the safe house. The burden of secrets was becoming unbearable, and Emma deserved to understand the full scope of what they were facing. More importantly, they needed allies who understood the historical context of David's evidence, people who could help them navigate the dangerous waters ahead. The town of Brattleboro appeared through the forest canopy like a refuge from a simpler time. White church steeples and Victorian houses clustered around a main street that seemed untouched by the conspiracy theories and shadow governments that had dominated their lives for the past week. Marcus found a small motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where cash payments didn't require extensive documentation. Emma collapsed on one of the room's twin beds with exhaustion that had been held at bay by adrenaline and necessity. For the first time since this ordeal began, Marcus saw her as what she truly was, a 10-year-old girl who'd been thrust into circumstances no child should have to endure. The resilience she'd displayed was remarkable, but it was taking a toll that wouldn't be fully apparent until much later. While Emma napped, Marcus used the motel's landline to place a call that David's emergency protocols had specified for exactly this situation. The number connected him to Sarah Mitchell, the journalist who'd covered Watergate and had maintained contacts within the intelligence community for 5 decades. Her voice was cautious but immediately alert when Marcus identified himself using David's authentication codes. Sarah Mitchell agreed to meet them that evening at a restaurant in downtown Brattleboro with security protocols that reflected her decades of experience investigating sensitive subjects. But there was something in her tone, a quality Marcus couldn't quite identify, that suggested her interest in their situation went beyond professional curiosity. Emma woke as the sun was setting, her rest having restored some of the energy that sustained her remarkable composure. She listened carefully as Marcus explained their plans for the evening meeting, asking practical questions that demonstrated her growing understanding of operational security and risk assessment. The restaurant Sarah had chosen was crowded enough to provide anonymity, but quiet enough to allow confidential conversation. Marcus and Emma arrived early, establishing surveillance and confirming that the location appeared secure before Sarah Mitchell made her entrance precisely on schedule. She was older than Marcus had expected, probably in her 70s, but her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who'd spent her career uncovering secrets that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. Her silver hair was cut in a practical style that suggested function over fashion, and her handshake conveyed both strength and assessment. But it was her reaction to Emma that told Marcus there was more to this meeting than he'd initially understood. Sarah's expression softened when she looked at David's granddaughter, and there was recognition in her eyes that went beyond professional interest. The conversation began with Sarah's verification of their identities and her confirmation that she'd been expecting this contact for years. David had established communication protocols with her decades earlier, preparing for the possibility that his evidence would someday need to reach someone with the expertise and connections to bring it to public attention. But as the conversation progressed, Sarah's personal investment in their situation became increasingly apparent. She wasn't just a journalist who'd covered intelligence community stories. She had intimate knowledge of David's work, detailed understanding of Operation Nightshade, and emotional reactions to David's fate that suggested a relationship that went far beyond professional collaboration. Emma, with her pattern recognition skills and intuitive understanding of adult emotions, was the first to grasp the significance of what she was observing. During a pause in the conversation, she asked Sarah directly whether she'd known David personally, and the question opened a floodgate of revelations that recontextualized everything Marcus thought he understood about his father's life. Sarah Mitchell had been more than just a journalist covering David's investigation. She'd been his lover, his confidant, and ultimately his co-conspirator in the effort to document Guardian activities. Their relationship had begun in the early 1970s when Sarah was a young reporter covering the Watergate hearings, and David was a military intelligence officer conducting his own investigation of related security breaches. The personal relationship had deepened as their professional collaboration revealed the scope of the conspiracy they were uncovering. Sarah had used her media contacts to verify information, while David gathered evidence through intelligence channels, creating a partnership that was both professionally productive and personally intimate. But Sarah's revelation went deeper than Marcus had prepared for. She'd known about Marcus from birth, had followed his childhood and military career from a distance, and had maintained her own surveillance of Guardian activities, partly out of professional interest, but primarily out of love for the man who'd been forced into exile to protect his son. The emotional impact on Marcus was immediate and overwhelming. Not only had his father been alive throughout his childhood, watching from a distance, but there had been a woman who'd loved David, who'd shared his burden, who'd known about Marcus's existence, and had been silently protecting him for decades. Emma absorbed this revelation with the emotional intelligence that had sustained her through her parents' divorce and the recent upheaval of their lives. She asked Sarah practical questions about her relationship with David, about her knowledge of Guardian activities, and about her assessment of their current situation. Sarah's answers painted a picture of a conspiracy that had evolved and expanded far beyond David's original investigation. The Guardians weren't just a historical remnant from the 1970s. They were an active shadow government that had survived multiple presidential administrations, recruiting new members across party lines, and accumulating power that allowed them to influence American policy at the highest levels. More disturbing was Sarah's intelligence about recent Guardian activities. They'd been systematically eliminating potential threats to their security using methods that ranged from character assassination to actual murder. David's death 6 months earlier had been officially attributed to natural causes, but Sarah's investigation suggested it had been carefully orchestrated to look like heart failure while actually being induced by sophisticated toxins. The Guardians had decided that David's exile no longer provided adequate security for their operations, and they'd eliminated him before he could pass his evidence to someone capable of acting on it. But they hadn't anticipated that Marcus would inherit not just property, but the complete documentary record of their activities. Sarah's personal agenda became clear as the conversation progressed. She wasn't just interested in exposing the conspiracy for journalistic reasons. She wanted revenge for David's murder, justice for the man she'd loved and lost to forces that had controlled and ultimately destroyed his life. But Sarah also brought devastating news about their immediate situation. The Guardians had identified Marcus as David's heir and had mobilized resources to eliminate both him and Emma before they could bring the evidence to public attention. The military operation that had destroyed David's house was just the beginning of a systematic effort to erase every trace of the investigation that had consumed David's life. The custody battle that Victoria had initiated wasn't just about divorce and visitation rights. It was part of a Guardian operation designed to separate Marcus from Emma, making both of them more vulnerable to elimination. Richard Hamilton's influence had been used to manipulate the legal system, creating circumstances that would allow the Guardians to act against them with minimal risk of public attention. Emma's sharp intake of breath indicated that she understood the implications immediately. The sophisticated child custody challenge, the expedited legal proceedings, the systematic attack on Marcus's fitness as a parent, it was all part of a coordinated effort to isolate them and create opportunities for the Guardians to eliminate them quietly. Marcus felt the full weight of the conspiracy settling around them like a trap that had been decades in the making. David's enemies weren't just historical figures from the 1970s. They were active, powerful, and willing to use every resource at their disposal to protect their operations from exposure. But Sarah brought more than just devastating news about their situation. She'd spent 50 years building her own network of contacts within the intelligence community, journalism, and political circles. She knew people who suspected Guardian influence, but lacked evidence to take action, individuals who would be willing to help if provided with the documentation that David had accumulated. The strategic discussion that followed revealed both the scope of what they were attempting and the resources they would need to succeed. Exposing the Guardians would require more than just presenting evidence. They would need to coordinate simultaneous revelations across multiple media outlets, provide protection for witnesses who came forward, and ensure that the evidence couldn't be discredited or suppressed by Guardian influence within government agencies. Sarah's plan was ambitious and dangerous. She would use her journalistic contacts to prepare comprehensive articles that would be published simultaneously in major newspapers and magazines, making it impossible for the Guardians to suppress the story through their usual methods of influence and intimidation. But the plan required Marcus and Emma to survive long enough for the articles to be prepared and published, a challenge that was becoming more difficult as Guardian resources were mobilized against them. Sarah's intelligence suggested that they had days, possibly hours, before the net closed completely. The meeting was interrupted by Emma's urgent whisper about suspicious activity outside the restaurant. A black SUV had parked across the street, and its occupants were conducting surveillance with professional equipment that suggested military or intelligence backgrounds. The Guardians had found them again despite their security precautions and circuitous route to the meeting. Sarah's reaction was immediate and professional, activating contingency plans that she'd obviously prepared for exactly this situation. She provided Marcus with secure communication equipment and detailed instructions for reaching a network of safe houses that she'd established independently of any government facility. But the escape from the restaurant required coordination and timing that left no room for error. Sarah would leave first, drawing surveillance away from Marcus and Emma while they exited through the kitchen and reached their motorcycle through service alleys that would minimize their exposure. The plan worked, but barely. Marcus and Emma reached their motorcycle as Guardian operatives were entering the restaurant, their timing perfect, but their margin for error non-existent. The pursuit began immediately with multiple vehicles coordinating to trap them in the downtown area where their motorcycles' advantages would be minimized. Marcus used every evasion technique he'd learned in Special Forces training, leading their pursuers through residential neighborhoods and industrial areas where narrow streets and multiple turns would complicate their coordination. Emma clung to him with absolute trust, her confidence in his abilities allowing her to maintain composure despite the immediate danger. They finally escaped and onto rural highways, where the motorcycle's speed and maneuverability gave them temporary advantage, but Marcus knew the victory was brief. The Guardians had resources that included not just ground vehicles, but aircraft, electronic surveillance, and coordination capabilities that would make sustained evasion extremely difficult. As they rode through the Vermont countryside under cover of darkness, Marcus began to understand that their situation was more desperate than he'd initially realized. The Guardians weren't just protecting historical secrets, they were actively eliminating threats to ongoing operations that reached into every level of American government. But Emma had been thinking strategically about their situation, her analytical mind finding patterns and possibilities that offered hope despite their desperate circumstances. She pointed out that the Guardians' willingness to use military force against civilian targets on American soil represented a major escalation that would attract attention from legitimate government agencies. More importantly, Sarah's network of contacts meant they weren't fighting alone. There were people within the system who suspected Guardian influence and were prepared to act if provided with sufficient evidence. The challenge was surviving long enough to make those connections and coordinate the kind of coordinated exposure that would make suppression impossible. The safe house Sarah had directed them to was located in an abandoned ski resort in the mountains east of Brattleboro. The facility had been closed for decades, but Sarah's notes indicated that it had been modified to provide secure communications and defensive positions for exactly the kind of situation they were facing. Marcus and Emma arrived at the location near midnight, their motorcycle hidden in a maintenance building, while they explored the abandoned resort that would serve as their temporary base of operations. The main lodge was structurally sound despite decades of neglect, and the basement contained communication equipment that would allow them to coordinate with Sarah's network without revealing their location. But the most important discovery came when Emma found Sarah's research files documentation that corroborated and extended David's evidence about Guardian activities. Sarah had spent 50 years conducting her own investigation, accumulating independent proof of the conspiracy that would make it impossible for the Guardians to discredit their revelations as the fantasies of a paranoid recluse. The files also contained something that changed Marcus's understanding of his relationship with Victoria and the circumstances that had led to their marriage. According to Sarah's investigation, David hadn't just been watching Marcus from a distance during his childhood and military service. He'd been actively manipulating events to protect his son from Guardian attention. The introduction to Victoria Hamilton hadn't been accidental. David had arranged for Marcus to meet Richard Hamilton's daughter, believing that a connection to the Hamilton family would provide protection for his son. If Marcus was part of the Guardian network through marriage, he would be less likely to be seen as a threat that needed elimination. The marriage that Marcus had thought was based on love and attraction had actually been orchestrated by his father as a security measure, a way of hiding his son within the very conspiracy that had driven David into exile. Victoria might not have been aware of the manipulation, but her father certainly had been. The revelation was devastating on multiple levels. Marcus's marriage, his relationship with Emma's mother, even his daughter's existence were all products of his father's strategic planning rather than natural development. David had been controlling Marcus's life from a distance, making decisions about his future without his knowledge or consent. Emma absorbed this information with the emotional resilience that had carried her through every crisis they'd faced. But Marcus could see the impact on her young face. Her parents' marriage hadn't just failed due to incompatibility or changing circumstances. It had been built on deception from the very beginning, a foundation of lies that made its collapse inevitable. The weight of these revelations was crushing, but they were interrupted by news that made their personal struggles seem secondary to immediate survival concerns. Sarah's voice came through the secure communication system with urgent intelligence about guardian activities. Child Protective Services had obtained an emergency court order for Emma's immediate removal from Marcus's custody based on allegations that he was psychologically unstable and potentially dangerous. The legal proceeding had been expedited through Richard Hamilton's influence, creating a situation where law enforcement agencies would be actively searching for Emma to place her in protective custody. Marcus realized that the Guardians had found the perfect weapon against him. They couldn't openly attack him without risking public attention, but they could use the legal system to separate him from Emma, making both of them more vulnerable to elimination. The custody challenge that had seemed like Victoria's personal vendetta was actually a sophisticated operation designed to isolate them for termination. The choice before Marcus was stark and terrible. He could comply with the legal system, allowing Emma to be taken into protective custody where the Guardians would have access to her, or he could become a fugitive protecting his daughter by putting both of them outside the protection of the law. Emma made the decision for both of them with the wisdom that had sustained them throughout this ordeal. She pointed out that the legal system had been corrupted by Guardian influence, that compliance would mean death, and that their only chance of survival lay in staying together and fighting back with the evidence they'd inherited from David. The abandoned ski resort suddenly felt less like a refuge and more like a trap as Marcus realized that every government agency, every law enforcement officer, every social services worker would soon be looking for them. They were about to become the most wanted fugitives in Vermont, hunted not just by the Guardians but by legitimate authorities who believed they were protecting a child from an unstable parent. But Sarah's final message brought both hope and terrifying responsibility. She'd made contact with congressional staffers who were willing to investigate Guardian activities if provided with sufficient evidence. The exposure operation was moving forward, but its success depended on Marcus and Emma surviving long enough for the truth to reach public attention. The war that David Clark had been preparing for his entire adult life was escalating beyond anything he'd anticipated, and Marcus was beginning to understand that victory would require sacrifices that went far beyond personal safety or comfort. As dawn approached over the Vermont mountains, Marcus held his sleeping daughter close and prepared for a battle that would determine not just their survival, but the future of American constitutional government. The Guardians had controlled events from the shadows for 50 years, but David's legacy was about to emerge into the light, carried by the son who'd never known him and the granddaughter who'd inherited his unshakable commitment to truth and justice. The real fight was just beginning, and there would be no retreat. The abandoned ski resort's main lodge creaked in the pre-dawn wind as Marcus monitored police frequencies on Sarah's communication equipment. The manhunt had begun with systematic efficiency that confirmed his worst fears about Guardian influence within law enforcement. Every state trooper, local sheriff, and federal agent in New England was now searching for a psychologically unstable veteran who had abducted his daughter to avoid legitimate custody proceedings. Emma slept fitfully on a makeshift bed near the communication station, her young face troubled even in sleep by the weight of everything they'd discovered. Marcus watched her with a mixture of protective fury and crushing guilt. His daughter had inherited not just David's intelligence, but the burden of secrets that had already destroyed one generation of their family. The secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Henry Foster. His intelligence network had uncovered something that changed everything they thought they understood about their situation. Richard Hamilton's reaction to David's death had been more complex than simple relief at the elimination of a threat. According to intercepted communications, Hamilton had been shocked to learn that David Clark had survived until 2023. Foster's message included audio recordings that revealed the depth of Hamilton's miscalculation. In conversations with other Guardian leadership, Hamilton admitted that he'd believed David had been eliminated in 1975, shortly after his initial investigation of Operation Nightshade. The discovery that David had lived for nearly 50 additional years, accumulating evidence, all that time, had shaken Hamilton's confidence in Guardian security procedures. The recordings painted a picture of a conspiracy that had grown complacent over decades, assuming that threats from the 1970s had been permanently neutralized. David's survival represented a systematic intelligence failure that called into question everything the Guardians thought they knew about their operational security. But Hamilton's shock had quickly transformed into rage, and his current operations reflected not just tactical necessity, but personal vendetta against the man who'd outsmarted him for half a century. The resources being mobilized against Marcus and Emma weren't just about eliminating witnesses. They were about settling a score that Hamilton had thought was resolved decades earlier. Emma woke with the instant alertness that had become her survival mechanism, immediately focusing on the intelligence Foster had provided. Her analytical mind processed the implications with frightening clarity. If Hamilton had been operating under the assumption that David was dead since 1975, then many of his strategic decisions over the past 50 years had been based on incomplete information. This revelation offered tactical opportunities that hadn't been apparent before. The Guardians' current operations were reactive rather than proactive, responding to a threat they hadn't anticipated rather than executing carefully planned contingencies. Hamilton was improvising, and improvisation created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by opponents who understood the true scope of the situation. Marcus found himself increasingly dependent on Emma's analytical capabilities, her ability to see patterns and connections that his military training hadn't prepared him to recognize. She wasn't just surviving their ordeal. She was becoming an active strategist in their fight against forces that had controlled American policy for half a century. The morning brought news that forced them to accelerate their timeline. Michael Chen, the lawyer Sarah had recommended, was preparing to file emergency motions that would force public hearings on the custody case. But Chen's legal strategy required Marcus and Emma to surrender to federal authorities within 48 hours, trusting that congressional oversight and media attention would provide protection from Guardian elimination efforts. The proposal terrified Marcus on multiple levels. Surrendering meant putting their lives in the hands of a legal system that had already been thoroughly corrupted by Guardian influence. But continuing to run meant eventual capture by forces that had unlimited resources and no constitutional constraints on their methods. Emma's assessment was characteristically direct. They had no good choices, only degrees of terrible risk. But she'd been studying David's architectural plans for the ski resort, and she'd identified defensive positions that could allow them to control any confrontation that developed. If they had to fight, they could choose the ground and timing rather than being surprised by Guardian assault teams. The tactical discussion was interrupted by urgent intelligence from Foster. Guardian communications had revealed that Richard Hamilton himself was en route to Vermont, accompanied by a team of military contractors who operated outside normal command structures. This wasn't just about eliminating witnesses anymore. Hamilton was personally involved in settling the score with David Clark's legacy. But Hamilton's personal involvement also created opportunities that might not exist if the operation were being conducted by professional operatives alone. Personal motivation could lead to tactical errors, emotional decisions that would create vulnerabilities in otherwise sound operational planning. Emma had been examining the ski resort's layout with the focused attention she brought to every challenge they faced. The facility's designers had incorporated multiple levels and connecting passages that could be used to complicate any assault, creating opportunities for defenders who understood the terrain to outmaneuver attackers with superior numbers and equipment. More importantly, the resort's main lodge was built into the mountainside in a way that provided natural defensive positions and escape routes that wouldn't be obvious to attackers unfamiliar with the facility's construction. David had chosen this location not just for its isolation, but for its tactical advantages in exactly the kind of confrontation they now faced. The defensive preparations required both military expertise and Emma's architectural analysis. Marcus used his special forces training to establish fields of fire and fallback positions, while Emma identified concealed passages and communication routes that could allow them to coordinate defensive actions while maintaining mobility. But their preparations were complicated by the need to protect David's evidence, while simultaneously using it as leverage in their negotiations with legitimate authorities. The documents couldn't be allowed to fall into Guardian hands, but they also couldn't be destroyed without eliminating the only proof of the conspiracy that had controlled American policy for decades. Emma's solution demonstrated strategic thinking that impressed Marcus with its sophistication. She suggested creating multiple copies of the most critical evidence, distributing them through different security systems that would ensure survival, even if their primary documentation was compromised. The approach required technical capabilities they didn't possess, but it showed understanding of operational security that suggested she'd inherited David's professional instincts along with his moral commitment. The copying process was interrupted by news that changed the immediate tactical situation. Chen's legal team had succeeded in forcing an emergency custody hearing that would take place within 24 hours. Judge Eleanor Marks, the same official who had granted Marcus custody, originally would review the state's case for emergency removal of Emma from his care. The hearing represented both opportunity and enormous risk. If Chen could present David's evidence in open court, the resulting publicity would make Guardian suppression efforts much more difficult. But appearing in court would also expose Marcus and Emma to Guardian assets within the legal system, creating opportunities for elimination that wouldn't exist while they remained in hiding. Emma's analysis of the legal strategy led to insights that Marcus found both encouraging and terrifying. She pointed out that the custody hearing would require the state to present evidence of Marcus's unfitness as a parent, forcing them to rely on Guardian influence reports that could be challenged with David's documentation of the conspiracy. But Emma also recognized that the hearing would create a target-rich environment where Guardian operatives could act under cover of legitimate law enforcement activities. The courthouse would be surrounded by police officers, federal agents, and court security personnel, any of whom could be Guardian assets with authorization to eliminate threats to operational security. The decision about whether to attend the hearing was complicated by intelligence from Foster that revealed the scope of Guardian preparations. Hamilton's team included not just military contractors, but specialists in what they euphemistically called close protection services. Operatives trained in elimination techniques that could be implemented in public settings without attracting attention. Marcus realized that attending the hearing would require defensive preparations that went far beyond normal security concerns. They would be walking into what amounted to a combat zone surrounded by potential enemies who could act with legal authority in superior numbers. But Emma had been studying the courthouse's architectural plans with the same attention she'd given to the ski resort's defensive positions. The building's design included multiple entrances, service corridors, and structural features that could provide concealment and escape routes for defendants who understood how to use them. More importantly, Emma had identified what she called cascade points in the building's design zone, locations where defensive actions could disrupt multiple attack vectors simultaneously. Her 10-year-old mind was processing tactical challenges with sophistication that suggested she'd inherited David's operational capabilities along with his intellectual gifts. The preparation for the courthouse confrontation required coordination between multiple elements that had to function perfectly under extreme pressure. Chen's legal team would present David's evidence while Marcus and Emma maintained defensive positions that would allow them to respond to any Guardian attempts at elimination. But the plan also required trust in individuals whose reliability couldn't be verified in advance. Chen claimed to have security arrangements that would protect them during the hearing, but Marcus's military experience had taught him that no security was perfect against determined opponents with superior resources. Emma's concerns about the legal strategy reflected wisdom that went beyond her years. She pointed out that appearing in court would require them to follow procedures and protocols that would limit their tactical flexibility while potentially exposing them to threats they couldn't anticipate or counter effectively. The debate about tactics was resolved by intelligence that forced their hand. Guardian communications revealed that Hamilton's elimination teams were converging on their location with sufficient force to ensure that traditional defensive positions would be overwhelmed. They had hours, possibly less, before the ski resort became a death trap. The evacuation required precision timing and coordination that left no margin for error. Emma's knowledge of the facility's hidden passages allowed them to reach their concealed motorcycle, while Guardian surveillance teams were still establishing perimeter positions around the main lodge. But the escape was only the beginning of a running battle that would continue until they reached either the safety of the courthouse or elimination by Hamilton's specialists. The route to the hearing would take them through territory that Guardian forces had spent hours preparing, creating multiple opportunities for interception and elimination. Marcus used every evasion technique he'd learned in Special Forces training, but their pursuers had advantages that made traditional escape methods increasingly ineffective. Satellite surveillance, communication intercepts, and predictive modeling allowed Guardian forces to anticipate their movements and establish ambush positions along their most likely routes. The motorcycle chase through Vermont's mountain roads became a deadly game of action and reaction, with Marcus constantly adjusting their path to avoid traps while Emma monitored Guardian communications and identified new threats as they developed. Her ability to process multiple information streams while maintaining tactical awareness impressed Marcus with its professional quality. But Emma's most important contribution came when she recognized a pattern in Guardian communication protocols that revealed they were being herded rather than simply pursued. Hamilton's forces were using their superior numbers and resources to channel Marcus and Emma toward a specific location where overwhelming force could be brought to bear. The realization that they were walking into a carefully constructed trap required immediate tactical adjustment. Instead of continuing toward the courthouse on their planned route, Marcus diverted to the abandoned mining complex that Emma had identified as an alternative defensive position. The mining facility's underground tunnels and processing buildings provided the kind of complex terrain that could neutralize Guardian advantages in numbers and equipment. More importantly, the facility's industrial infrastructure included communication systems that could allow them to coordinate with Chen's legal team while maintaining defensive positions. But using the mining complex as a fortress also meant abandoning any hope of reaching the custody hearing, potentially forfeiting Emma to the state's protective custody while eliminating their opportunity to present David's evidence in open court. The tactical necessity of survival conflicted directly with their strategic objective of exposing the Guardian conspiracy. Emma's analysis of their situation led to a proposal that demonstrated strategic thinking Marcus found both brilliant and terrifying. She suggested using the mining facility not as a fortress, but as a communication center, broadcasting David's evidence directly to media outlets while maintaining defensive positions against Guardian assault teams. The plan required technical capabilities they didn't possess and communication channels they couldn't establish, but it offered the possibility of achieving their strategic objectives while maintaining tactical flexibility. Emma had found a way to transform their desperate defensive situation into an offensive operation against Guardian interests. The implementation required splitting their attention between immediate survival and complex technical operations, but Emma's analytical capabilities made it possible to coordinate multiple activities simultaneously. While Marcus established defensive positions, Emma worked to establish communication links that would allow them to present David's evidence to the public regardless of what happened to them personally. But the technical challenges were complicated by the approach of Hamilton's assault teams, who had identified their location and were preparing for a coordinated attack that would overwhelm any defensive positions they could establish. The mining facility that had seemed like refuge was rapidly becoming the site of their final stand. The assault began with systematic destruction of the facility's external defenses, followed by coordinated penetration of the underground tunnels that Emma had hoped would provide tactical advantages. Hamilton's forces were better prepared and more professional than Marcus had anticipated, with capabilities that suggested military rather than civilian backgrounds. But Emma's knowledge of the facility's layout allowed them to stay ahead of the assault teams while maintaining access to the communication equipment that was broadcasting David's evidence to news organizations across the country. The battle for the mining facility became a race between Guardian elimination efforts and public exposure of their conspiracy. The final confrontation took place in the facility's main processing chamber, where Marcus and Emma made their last stand while the evidence that had cost David Clark 30 years of exile was finally reaching the audience he'd always hoped it would find. The gunfire echoing through the underground chambers was accompanied by the electronic transmission of documents that would reshape public understanding of American government operations. Hamilton himself appeared for the final assault, his personal involvement in the operation, confirming that this had always been about more than operational security. The confrontation between Marcus and the man who had destroyed his father's life was brief but decisive ending, with Hamilton's elimination and the collapse of Guardian command structures that had depended on his leadership. But victory came at a price that Marcus hadn't anticipated. Emma had been wounded during the final assault, not seriously, but enough to require immediate medical attention that would expose her to the very child protective services they'd been fighting to avoid. The custody hearing that had seemed like such a threat now became their salvation as Judge Marks reviewed David's evidence while Emma recovered in a hospital room that was guarded by federal marshals rather than Guardian operatives. The legal system that had been corrupted by conspiracy was slowly being restored to its constitutional functions. The revelation of Guardian activities created political earthquakes that reshaped American government operations, but the most important victory was personal. Marcus had finally become the son David had always hoped he would be, and Emma had inherited not just her grandfather's intelligence, but his legacy of resistance against corruption and injustice. The war that had begun with a paranoid recluse's obsession with government secrets had ended with the restoration of constitutional government and the protection of a family that had paid the ultimate price for truth and justice. David Clark's mission was finally complete, carried to victory by the son who'd never known him and the granddaughter who'd proven worthy of his sacrifice. The federal courthouse in Burlington stood like a fortress against the October sky, its granite columns and imposing facade representing the constitutional principles that David Clark had spent his life defending. Marcus adjusted his tie with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what the next few hours would bring. Emma sat beside him in the defendant's waiting area, her small frame dwarfed by the formal clothes Chen's team had provided, but her eyes held the steady determination that had carried them through their ordeal. The night before the hearing had been sleepless, for both of them spent reviewing testimony strategies and contingency plans in a safe house that Foster's network had provided. Emma had insisted on understanding every aspect of the legal proceedings, asking questions that demonstrated her grasp of complexities that most adults would find overwhelming. Her preparation wasn't just thorough, it was obsessive, reflecting the analytical perfectionism she'd inherited from David. The events at the mining facility had ended with Hamilton's tactical withdrawal rather than his elimination, a development that left Marcus with a sense of unfinished business that gnawed at him. Intelligence reports suggested that Hamilton had regrouped with core Guardian leadership, planning what their intercepted communications described as final resolution protocols. The conspiracy that had survived for 50 years wasn't going to surrender without exhausting every resource at their disposal. Judge Eleanor Marks had agreed to an emergency hearing that would review not just the custody case, but the extraordinary circumstances that had brought federal attention to what should have been a routine family court proceeding. The courtroom was packed beyond its normal capacity, with reporters occupying every available seat and federal agents positioned at strategic points throughout the gallery. Congressional staffers took notes from designated areas, all drawn by preliminary reports of evidence that could reshape public understanding of American government operations over the past 50 years. Chen approached their table with documents that would serve as the foundation for their legal strategy, but his expression carried concern that went beyond normal pre-hearing anxiety. Intelligence from Foster's network suggested that Guardian operatives were planning to disrupt the proceedings, possibly through direct action that would eliminate key witnesses before their testimony could be recorded. The legal battlefield they were entering was also a literal one, where constitutional principles would be defended through both legal argument and physical courage. Marcus scanned the crowded courtroom with tactical awareness that identified potential threats among the sea of legitimate observers. Too many faces he didn't recognize, too many individuals whose positioning suggested professional rather than casual interest in the proceedings. 3 men near the back maintained sightlines to the witness stand while affecting the casual attention of journalists. A woman in the second row kept checking her phone with the frequency of someone coordinating external activities. The Guardians hadn't abandoned their mission despite the public exposure that had already begun. Emma noticed his surveillance activities and conducted her own assessment of the courtroom's occupants. Her pattern recognition skills, identifying the same individuals who had caught Marcus's attention. Her whispered observations demonstrated tactical awareness that impressed him even as it worried him. No 10-year-old should be able to identify potential assassins in a federal courthouse, but Emma's recent experiences had forced her to develop capabilities that most adults never acquired. Victoria sat across the courtroom with her reduced legal team, her appearance showing the emotional toll of learning about her father's criminal activities over the past weeks. Dark circles under her eyes suggested sleepless nights spent processing the reality that her entire life had been built on foundations of betrayal and corruption. The woman Marcus had once loved was grappling with the discovery that the family fortune she'd inherited was blood money earned through 50 years of systematic treason against the country that had made her father's wealth possible. Her occasional glances toward Emma carried a mixture of guilt and longing that suggested genuine remorse for the role she'd played in the Guardian conspiracy, even if that participation had been unwitting. Victoria's transformation from adversary into potential ally was complicated by the depth of deception she'd discovered within her own family revelations that had shattered her understanding of everything she'd believed about her identity and values. The hearing began with Chen's presentation of evidence that established the context for everything that had followed. David Clark's investigation of Operation Nightshade, his discovery of systematic intelligence selling, and his forced exile to protect both his findings and his family. The documents spoke for themselves, painting a picture of patriotism punished and truth suppressed by forces that had operated outside constitutional authority for decades. Chen's presentation was methodical and comprehensive, building a legal foundation that would be difficult for even Guardian influence officials to dismiss or discredit. Judge Marks listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that she was witnessing history being made in her courtroom. Her questions were precise and probing, designed to establish not just the legal admissibility of the evidence, but its broader implications for American government operations. The evidence Chen presented wasn't just relevant to the custody case, it was reshaping understanding of intelligence community activities in ways that would have consequences for years to come. The judge's demeanor suggested both professional fascination and personal outrage at the scope of the conspiracy being revealed. Her background included military service before law school, giving her the context to understand the implications of the intelligence compromises that David had documented. The betrayal of American service members wasn't just a legal matter for Judge Marks. It was a personal affront to values she'd sworn to defend. Sarah Mitchell's testimony provided the personal dimension of David's sacrifice, the love story that had been interrupted by forces that valued secrecy over human connection. Her 50-year investigation had provided independent corroboration of David's findings while extending them into areas he hadn't been able to penetrate. The emotional weight of her testimony was evident in her voice as she described the man who had chosen duty over personal happiness, country over family, truth over safety. Sarah's recollections of David painted a picture of someone who had understood the cost of his choices but had made them anyway, believing that future generations deserved to inherit a country where constitutional principles were more than historical artifacts. Her description of David's anguish over abandoning his son was heartbreaking in its honesty, revealing the personal toll that heroic choices often demanded from those willing to make them. Emma listened to Sarah's testimony with the focused attention she brought to everything, but Marcus could see tears forming in her eyes as she heard about David's love for the woman he'd had to leave behind. The grandfather she'd never known was becoming more real, more human through Sarah's memories of the man who'd sacrificed everything for principles that transcended personal happiness. Emma's emotional response was controlled but genuine, reflecting the mature understanding she'd developed of adult choices and their consequences. The courtroom drama reached its first climax when Emma herself asked to address the court, her young voice carrying authority that surprised everyone present. Judge Marks had initially been reluctant to allow a 10-year-old to testify in proceedings of this complexity, but Emma's preparation and understanding of the issues had convinced Chen that her perspective was essential to establishing the full scope of what they were fighting to protect. Emma's testimony was remarkable for both its analytical precision and its emotional clarity. She explained her role in deciphering David's codes, her discovery of the evidence that had sparked their flight from Guardian pursuit, and her understanding of why David's work needed to continue. Her description of the pattern recognition techniques she'd used to unlock David's secrets demonstrated intellectual capabilities that impressed even the congressional staffers who were monitoring the proceedings. But Emma's most powerful moment came when she addressed the question of why a 10-year-old should be involved in matters of national security and government corruption. Her response was simple and devastating because adults had failed to protect the principles that were supposed to ensure that children could grow up in a free country. The corruption David had exposed wasn't just historical, it was ongoing, threatening the future that Emma and her generation were supposed to inherit. Emma's testimony was interrupted by commotion at the back of the courtroom as federal agents moved to intercept individuals whose behavior had triggered security protocols. The disruption created confusion that Marcus's military training recognized as deliberate tactical diversion, the kind of misdirection that preceded coordinated assault operations. The Guardian operatives he'd identified earlier were moving using the chaos to position themselves for actions that would be difficult to stop once initiated. The realization that Guardian operatives were moving against them in the middle of a federal courthouse filled Marcus with rage that transcended tactical considerations. These people were so desperate to protect their conspiracy that they were willing to attack American citizens in the heart of the constitutional system they claimed to serve. The audacity of the assault was matched only by its desperation, suggesting that the Guardians understood they were facing complete exposure if the hearing continued. Judge Marks attempted to maintain order as security personnel responded to the developing threat, but the courtroom was rapidly becoming a battlefield where constitutional principles would be defended through physical courage as well as legal argument. The evacuation procedures that were implemented created additional chaos that Guardian operatives were obviously prepared to exploit. But Emma's response to the developing crisis demonstrated capabilities that Marcus hadn't fully appreciated until that moment. Instead of freezing with fear or looking to adults for protection, she immediately began moving toward exits she'd identified during their reconnaissance of the building the previous day. Her movement was purposeful and informed, reflecting the tactical awareness she'd developed during their weeks as fugitives. Emma's knowledge of the courthouse's architectural features gained through the same analytical approach she'd applied to every building they'd encountered allowed her to navigate service corridors and maintenance passages that most people never noticed. She wasn't just escaping, she was using the building's hidden infrastructure to outmaneuver opponents who had superior numbers but inferior knowledge of the terrain they were fighting on. Marcus followed Emma through passages that connected different sections of the courthouse, marveling at his daughter's tactical awareness and spatial intelligence. The 10-year-old girl who led him through a maze of service tunnels and mechanical rooms had developed genuine expertise in urban evasion skills that would have impressed Special Forces instructors. She'd inherited David's professional instincts along with his analytical capabilities, demonstrating capabilities that suggested she could become a formidable opponent of corruption wherever she encountered it. The pursuit through the courthouse's hidden infrastructure became a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Guardian operatives trying to corner them while Emma used her knowledge of the building's design to stay ahead of their coordination. Radio chatter from their pursuers indicated professional training and equipment, confirming that Hamilton had deployed his most capable assets for what he obviously considered a final resolution of the threat that David's evidence represented. Marcus realized that his daughter had learned more from their recent experiences than simple survival skills. She'd developed a genuine expertise in evasion and tactical thinking capabilities that exceeded his own understanding of the courthouse's layout and defensive possibilities. The child he'd been trying to protect had become a partner in their fight for survival, someone whose capabilities were essential to their continued success. But the Guardian operatives weren't just pursuing them through the building randomly. Emma's analysis of their movement patterns revealed that they were being herded toward a specific location where additional resources were waiting. The courthouse that should have represented constitutional protection was being used as a trap by forces that had no respect for the principles it was supposed to embody. The pursuit led them deeper into the courthouse's basement levels, where mechanical systems and storage areas provided both concealment and tactical complications. Emma's navigation through this underground maze demonstrated spatial intelligence that impressed Marcus with its sophistication. She was thinking several moves ahead, anticipating how their pursuers would attempt to cut off their escape routes while identifying alternatives that wouldn't be obvious to conventional tactical thinking. The confrontation took place in the courthouse's main mechanical room, where Richard Hamilton waited with resources that would ensure final resolution of the threat that David's evidence represented to Guardian operations. The man who had destroyed David's life 50 years earlier was finally meeting the son he'd forced into exile and the granddaughter who carried the legacy of resistance that had survived despite every attempt to eliminate it. Hamilton's presence in the courthouse basement was shocking in its brazenness, but it also confirmed the desperate nature of Guardian operations. The conspiracy that had operated from shadows for 50 years was now willing to conduct military operations in federal buildings, accepting exposure risks that previous generations of Guardian leadership would have considered unacceptable. The architect of 5 decades of conspiracy looked like any other wealthy businessman, distinguished and confident, but entirely unremarkable in ways that made his crimes seem even more horrific. This was the man who had sold American military secrets for profit, who had built a fortune on the blood of soldiers who died because of compromised intelligence, who had corrupted American institutions for personal gain while presenting himself as a patriotic citizen. Hamilton's casual demeanor cracked when he looked at Emma, seeing in her young face the same analytical intelligence that had made David such a dangerous opponent. The 10-year-old girl who studied him with clinical attention represented everything he'd tried to eliminate through 50 years of violence and manipulation. Her presence in the mechanical room was living proof that the Clark legacy had survived despite every attempt to destroy it. The conversation that followed was conducted in the careful language of intelligence professionals, but Hamilton's meaning was clear. He was offering Marcus the same choice he'd given David decades earlier: wealth, position, and security in exchange for silence about Guardian operations. The conspiracy was always looking for new members, and Marcus's military background would make him a valuable asset in operations that required someone with special forces training. Hamilton's offer was comprehensive and seductive, including not just immediate financial rewards, but long-term security for Emma's education and future development. The Guardian Network could provide opportunities and protection that would ensure Emma's success in whatever career she chose, as long as that career didn't include continuing David's investigation of their activities. But Emma's response to Hamilton's offer demonstrated wisdom that transcended her age and experience. She pointed out that the Guardian conspiracy had survived for 50 years by corrupting individuals who should have been protecting constitutional principles, that accepting Hamilton's offer would make Marcus part of the problem that had destroyed their family. Her analysis was both morally clear and tactically sound, recognizing that Guardian offers of protection were actually threats disguised as opportunities. Emma also made an observation that changed Marcus's understanding of their situation completely. She'd been studying Hamilton during his presentation, and her pattern recognition skills had identified signs of desperation rather than confidence. The Guardian leader wasn't negotiating from strength but from weakness, trying to salvage something from operations that were already failing due to the exposure that David's evidence had created. Hamilton's body language, vocal patterns, and tactical choices all suggested someone who was improvising rather than executing carefully planned contingencies. Emma's analysis revealed that the man who had controlled American policy from shadows for 50 years was actually cornered, facing the collapse of everything he'd built through decades of patient corruption and manipulation. The revelation that Hamilton was desperate rather than dominant transformed the tactical situation completely. Marcus realized that he held advantages he hadn't recognized, that David's evidence had already begun dismantling the conspiracy that Hamilton had spent his life building. The Guardian Network's strength had always depended on secrecy and deniability, both of which were being destroyed by the public exposure that was already underway. But Hamilton's desperation also made him more dangerous than he would have been if he'd been operating from a position of strength. Desperate men took risks that rational operators would avoid, including actions that could expose their organizations to scrutiny they'd previously been able to avoid. The Guardian leader was obviously prepared to use violence that would attract attention he'd spent 50 years trying to prevent. The standoff in the mechanical room was broken by Emma's tactical initiative rather than adult decision-making. She'd been studying the room's layout while Hamilton and Marcus talked, and she'd identified vulnerabilities in the Guardian positions that could be exploited by someone who understood the building's infrastructure and mechanical systems. Emma's activation of the courthouse's fire suppression system created chaos that allowed them to escape Hamilton's immediate control while alerting courthouse security to the Guardian operation that was taking place in the basement. The 10-year-old girl had turned Hamilton's tactical advantage into a liability through understanding of systems that his operatives hadn't considered when they'd established their positions. The water flooding the mechanical room disabled electronic equipment that Guardian operatives had been using for coordination, while creating confusion that masked Marcus and Emma's escape through service passages that connected to other parts of the building. Emma's knowledge of the courthouse's design allowed her to lead them toward areas where federal security would be concentrated, turning their tactical disadvantage into an opportunity to receive protection from legitimate authorities. But the escape from the mechanical room was just the beginning of a running battle that continued through the courthouse's hidden passages and service areas. Hamilton's operatives were better armed and more numerous, but Emma's knowledge of the building's design allowed her and Marcus to stay ahead of their pursuit while moving toward areas where federal security would be able to respond to the Guardian assault. The chase through the courthouse infrastructure became a test of everything Emma had learned during their weeks as fugitives. She used her analytical capabilities and tactical awareness to outmaneuver professional operatives who had superior resources but inferior understanding of the terrain they were fighting in. Her navigation through maintenance tunnels and service corridors demonstrated expertise that would have impressed military instructors. Marcus found himself following his daughter's lead rather than providing it, recognizing that Emma had developed genuine expertise in the kind of urban evasion that their situation required. She wasn't just surviving, she was taking control of their tactical situation in ways that demonstrated remarkable maturity and capability. The child he'd been trying to protect had become a partner whose contributions were essential to their success. But Emma's most important contribution came when she led them to the courthouse's main communication center, where she began broadcasting David's evidence directly to news organizations, while Marcus maintained defensive positions against Hamilton's assault teams. Her technical skills developed through her analysis of David's documentation systems allowed her to access communication equipment that would ensure the evidence reached its intended audience, regardless of what happened to them personally. The broadcast of David's complete files created the kind of public exposure that made Guardian suppression efforts impossible. News organizations across the country were simultaneously receiving documentation that would reshape public understanding of American government operations, making it too late for Hamilton to contain the damage through elimination of witnesses. The conspiracy that had survived through secrecy was being destroyed by the light of public scrutiny. Emma's coordination of the evidence release demonstrated strategic thinking that went beyond tactical survival skills. She understood that their personal safety depended on making their elimination more dangerous to Guardian interests than their survival, that public exposure was the most effective protection they could obtain against forces that operated through violence and intimidation. Hamilton's final assault on the communications center was as much about revenge as operational necessity. The man who had controlled American policy from the shadows for 50 years was watching his life's work dissolve under scrutiny from investigators who had resources the Guardians couldn't match or corrupt. His personal involvement in the assault reflected both desperation and rage at the failure of systems he'd spent decades perfecting. The final confrontation between Marcus and Hamilton took place while Emma continued broadcasting evidence from a secure position that Marcus's defensive actions had created. The battle was both physical and ideological, representing the culmination of a conflict that had been building for 50 years between those who believed in constitutional principles and those who thought they could improve upon them through secret manipulation. Hamilton's tactical skills were considerable, reflecting military training that had been enhanced by decades of operational experience. But his desperation made him careless, leading to mistakes that Marcus's Special Forces background allowed him to exploit. The confrontation was brief but decisive, ending with Hamilton's capture rather than his elimination. The choice between revenge and justice was made easier by Emma's clear expectation that her father would choose the path that David would have wanted them to take. Marcus could honor his father's memory through violence or through commitment to the constitutional principles that David had died defending. The decision reflected values that had guided the Clark family through generations of service to their country. Marcus chose justice over revenge, using his military training to neutralize Hamilton without killing him, ensuring that the Guardian leader would face trial for his crimes rather than execution in a courthouse basement. The decision was tactical as well as moral. Recognizing that Hamilton's testimony could be essential to exposing the full scope of the conspiracy he'd helped create and lead. But Hamilton's capture was only the beginning of consequences that would reshape American government operations for years to come. The evidence that Emma had broadcast would trigger congressional investigations, federal prosecutions, and media scrutiny that would expose the full scope of Guardian activities over 5 decades. The shadow government that Hamilton had helped create was being systematically dismantled by the very constitutional processes it had tried to subvert. The legal proceedings that followed Hamilton's arrest revealed the extent to which the Guardian conspiracy had penetrated American institutions. Congressional hearings continued for months, exposing connections and operations that extended far beyond what anyone had initially understood. Intelligence agencies, defense contractors, academic institutions, and media organizations all showed evidence of Guardian influence that had shaped American policy in ways that served conspiracy interests rather than national security. Judge Marks's decision in the custody case was swift and decisive when the hearing finally resumed under heavy federal security. The state's evidence was dismissed as the product of conspiracy rather than legitimate concern, and Marcus's fitness as a parent was confirmed by the courage and judgment he demonstrated throughout their ordeal. But more importantly, the judge recognized Emma's remarkable capabilities and the special circumstances that would shape her future development. The custody arrangements that emerged from the legal proceedings were designed around Emma's needs rather than adult convenience or bureaucratic requirements. She would remain with Marcus as her primary guardian, but she would also have access to educational and developmental opportunities that would prepare her for the unique role she might choose to play in continuing David's work. The legal system was acknowledging that Emma wasn't just a child to be protected, but a citizen whose contributions were already essential to protecting constitutional principles. Emma's response to the custody decision demonstrated the emotional intelligence that complemented her analytical capabilities. She understood that the legal victory was just the beginning of challenges that would require sustained commitment over years or decades to complete. The war David had fought was won, but the peace would require different kinds of courage and different kinds of sacrifice. Victoria's transformation from adversary into ally was gradual but genuine, reflecting her commitment to rebuilding relationships with both Marcus and Emma. The revelation of her father's criminal activities had forced her to reevaluate everything she'd believed about her family and her life, leading to changes that made renewed relationship possible. Her apologies were heartfelt and specific, acknowledging not just the harm she'd caused, but her determination to earn forgiveness through sustained effort rather than expecting it as a right. But the most significant change was in Emma herself, whose experiences had accelerated her development in ways that concerned Marcus even as they impressed him. She'd been forced to mature beyond her years, to process adult realities that no 10-year-old should have to understand. The resilience that had sustained her through their ordeal had come at a cost that wouldn't be fully apparent for years to come, affecting her ability to relate to peers who hadn't shared her experiences. Emma's relationship with Marcus had been transformed by shared danger into something stronger than typical parent-child connection, but it had also been complicated by the realization that she possessed capabilities that exceeded his own in some areas. The 10-year-old girl who had outmaneuvered professional operatives and saved both their lives was no longer a child who could be protected through normal parental authority. She'd become a partner whose judgment was essential to their continued success. The house in Vermont was restored using funds from the Guardian assets that federal prosecutors had seized during their investigations. The irony of using conspiracy profits to fund transparency initiatives wasn't lost on anyone involved, but it provided poetic justice for crimes that had generated enormous wealth through betraying American interests. The restoration was comprehensive, returning the house to the grandeur David had inherited, but had been unable to maintain during his exile. Emma threw herself into the restoration project with enthusiasm that masked deeper currents of purpose. She was creating a monument to David's memory while building a foundation for continuing his work. The library that had hidden his secrets was transformed into a research center where future investigators could learn from his methods and continue his mission. Every detail of the restoration was planned to honor David's legacy while serving the practical needs of ongoing investigation. Sarah Mitchell became a frequent visitor to the restored house, her relationship with David's family providing the personal connection she'd been denied for 50 years. Her mentorship of Emma was both professional and personal, passing along not just investigative techniques, but memories of the grandfather Emma had never known. Sarah's presence helped heal wounds that had festered for decades, providing the family connection that David's exile had prevented. The David Clark Foundation was established with comprehensive funding that would ensure its work could continue for generations. Emma's involvement in the foundation's planning demonstrated her commitment to carrying David's legacy forward, but it also revealed the extent to which their recent experiences had changed her fundamental understanding of the world and her place in it. Marcus watched his daughter's development with pride tempered by concern and sadness. The path she was choosing would be difficult and dangerous, but it was also necessary and noble. Emma had inherited David's intelligence, his courage, and his unshakable commitment to truth, but she'd also inherited the burden of secrets that had already destroyed one generation of their family. Her childhood had ended in the courthouse basement where she'd helped capture Hamilton, replaced by responsibilities that would shape the rest of her life. The anniversary of David's death brought revelations that provided closure for some questions, while opening others that would require years to answer fully. David's final message to his family wasn't just about completing his investigation, but about building institutions that could continue the work of exposing corruption long after the current generation was gone. His vision extended beyond immediate justice to permanent change in how American institutions protected themselves from internal corruption. Emma's response to David's final message was immediate and decisive. She would dedicate her education and early career to developing the capabilities that would allow her to continue his work effectively, but she would do so with advantages he'd never possessed. Modern technology, international connections, and public awareness of corruption issues would provide tools that could be far more effective than the isolated investigation David had been forced to conduct. But Emma's commitment came with a recognition that the recent experiences had changed her relationship with Marcus permanently. She would always be his daughter, but she was also David's intellectual heir, someone whose mission might require choices that would put her in danger despite his desire to protect her. The balance between family responsibility and historical duty would define their relationship for the rest of their lives. The house on the Vermont mountainside stood restored to its original grandeur, its windows no longer boarded but open to let in light that had been excluded for too long. The gardens David had neglected during his exile were replanted and maintained, creating beauty from ground that had known only abandonment. But the most important restoration was of David's reputation and legacy, transformed from family embarrassment into source of pride that would inspire future generations. Emma stood in the restored library on the evening of the anniversary, surrounded by David's documents and evidence, but also by plans for the future that would carry his work into areas he could never have imagined. The forgotten inheritance had been claimed not just by his son, but by his granddaughter, who would ensure that the truth he had preserved would continue to serve justice long after his death. The war David Clark had fought for 50 years was over, but Emma understood that victory had created new battles that would require the same courage and commitment he had demonstrated. She was ready for those battles, armed with the evidence he had preserved, the principles he had died defending, and the analytical capabilities she'd developed through experiences that no child should have to endure. Marcus looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and sadness, understanding that their relationship had been forever changed by the weight of the legacy they'd inherited together. Emma would always be his child, but she was also something more now, a guardian of truth who would carry David's mission forward into a future neither of them could predict, but both of them were committed to protecting. The sun set over the Vermont mountains, casting long shadows across the restored estate, where a family had finally found the peace that had been denied them for generations, even as they prepared for battles that would define the rest of their lives. David's sacrifice had not been in vain, but its ultimate meaning would be determined by the choices his granddaughter made in the years to come. Choices that would test whether the principles he died defending could survive in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to truth and justice.